Tiffany, thank you so much for joining. We were talking on fire about how when you're an expert at something for 15 years, it doesn't feel new to you, but for people listening, this will. Give people a little bit of the background and why you kick so much ass at what you do.
Sure. So I'll start with the LinkedIn headline, which is I'm the CEO and founder of Diversability. The best way that I explain what we do to a more corporate audience is we're kind of like a disability employee resource group or a disability community that exists outside of a company. We're like the disability employee resource group for the world.
Hmm.
And I came into this space about 26 years ago as a result of a car accident. I was involved in a car accident. My dad was driving. He unfortunately passed away, and I acquired a slew of injuries, including permanently paralyzing one of my arms, breaking a couple bones in one of my legs. Broken bones did heal, and much later being diagnosed with a mental health disability known as post traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
I don't know if I was supposed to continue on from there.
I'll edit that out.
Did,
um,
did you think I was going to go on?
kind of.
Oh, okay.
No,
Okay.
no.
Oh, okay.
I do like to kind of just like fall back and kind of let you go, but I can edit out and just ask the very specific question. You know, you're writing a book, you're doing a lot of things in the space, but what to you is most important? What is kind of the mantra of how you want the community to be perceived, felt? What's most important to you?
Yeah. So, my book is called the Anti-Ableist Manifesto. And so the first question that people usually ask is, well, what's ableism? And the definition that I use is when we devalue someone based on the way their body and or mind works.
Hmm.
So what's driving me is how can we not devalue people based on the way their bodies are, based on the way their minds work, and just view everyone as having a gift that they have to impart on the world, and part of the human experience and the human journey is figuring out what that is. And I will say what kind of keeps me going in this work is as I've gotten to know more disabled people, our ecosystem is over 80,000. I still remember back to 15 years ago, trying to get one person to join was very difficult. So just seeing that transformation over time gives me hope. But we're magic. Like the disability community is magic. And I want other people to see us the way that I see us.
And it's not one, I mean, even in that community, it's not one full community. I mean, there are subsets of that community, I'm sure, that view things differently, just like every other community, right? That probably, on the spectrum of how they would even want to be, what terminology they want used, what things are most important. So, kind of how, when you have an 80,000 person community, you kind of make sure everyone's goals are achieved and everything's pushed forward.
Yeah, such a great question. So I guess I have a few talking points that are coming to mind. The first is that our mission is to elevate disability pride. And every single word that we have chosen in that tagline is very specific because you can be aware of disability, which that's the mission of a lot of disability organizations is to raise disability awareness, but you can
Mhm.
still think that disabled people, don't deserve to work or own homes or have a family or be in romantic
Yeah.
relationships, right? Disability pride is kind of like the middle finger to the world to say, I know that you view us as and our experience or our bodies as shameful, but I want to assert my worth because I know that I'm valuable just because I exist. So I wanted to share that first because our community is not for everyone. Diversibility is not for
Mhm.
everyone. And I think when I first started, I was like, oh, all disabled people can join. But one of the
Yeah.
things I've noticed is the transformation for us is what I call the shame to pride transformation. So that's okay, you've internalized a lot of things from society saying that you should feel ashamed about your existence as a disabled person. But I want to bring you along this transformation by being in community with other disabled people who don't want to view that aspect of themselves as shameful. So I want to acknowledge the disability community is not a monolith. Once you meet one disabled person, you've met one disabled person, right?
Mm.
But the people who join our community want to go on that transformational journey to say, I know this is an aspect. So for me, as someone who can't use one of my arms, it's something I think about every single day. Like, I just came from a yoga class right before this, and I was like, how do I carry my yoga mat and my gym bag at the same time and grab my keys and open the door? You know, that sounds like it requires more than two hands, but I've got one, right? And so I have to just figure out, I call this life hacking. I've just figured out how to life hack my way through, which kind of brings me to my second point, which is to your point, Jeff. Disability is so diverse. You have non-apparent disabilities like ADHD, dyslexia, autism, depression, anxiety, chronic illness, some chronic illnesses, even substance use disorders. And then you have more apparent ones like my paralyzed arm, people who are wheelchair users. But what unites us are two things. One is that we have had to be resilient in that we've had to be resilient in a world that wasn't built for us, and that we've experienced oppression in one way or another related to our
Yes.
disability identity. And so I say, okay, we're totally different. We have different preferences in terms of language, but all of us, and maybe a disabled person will listen to this and say, no, I've never experienced that. But I do, you know, there's something in our community we call disability culture. And I think when you root something in a culture, there's history, there's community there, there's shared experiences. And how can we connect on that baseline, but also have a level of respect that we're going to have different preferences and maybe even disagree about other things?
I think there's so much power, and even if yes, it's not a monolith, and I mean that is very important, right? But even just the power of having a large group of people that can speak to a varied but shared sense of experience that can then relay that experience, because bias is sometimes very intentional, bias is sometimes unintentional, and sometimes it's just based purely in ignorance of not knowing somebody else's lived experience. And so the more that you can hopefully get people to understand that lived experience, there's a part that sucks, which is that you shouldn't have to explain your worthiness to another group of people. That should not occur. It should be some kind of merging of like understanding of like, hello, this is what is required, what is necessary. Is there ever a little bit of frustration in having to go in that direct, like it's imparted on you and your group and everybody in Diversability and the entire community as a whole to try and bring people along?
Yeah, so I come back to a quote from another disability advocate named Emily Ladau. And she says, in order to make the world more accessible, we need to make the disability experience more accessible to the world.
Yeah.
That's not to say all of us as disabled people should or have to be educators. But I also, even if I look back at my own experience, so I know I didn't share this in my intro, but for about 12 years after I became disabled, I hid my arm by wearing long sleeves all the time. And I
Yeah.
didn't tell anyone about the details of the car accident. And what happened was it let other people make assumptions about the nature of my disability, what I could or couldn't do. A lot of people assumed it was from birth. And so my role as kind of leaning into this more disability educator space is I want to reclaim my narrative so that
Yeah.
I can get ahead of you making assumptions. So again, we're not a monolith. Not everyone feels comfortable. Even in my own story, there's some traumatic elements of it, right? I have PTSD from it at that
Yeah.
happening as a kid. And at the same time, I think I understand the value of people. I guess one quick story is coming to mind. Are you okay if I share it?
That is exactly why
Oh,
we're here.
that's why we're here.
We also have we have no time limits. Just because we're called the Shorty Awards doesn't mean we have to keep this to 10 minutes. Let's go.
Because it's short. So what I'll share is I actually think that the best disability allies come through intimacy. And it's not intimacy like having romantic partners, although that's one aspect of it. It's friends, it's colleagues, it's people who get to know us. And so interestingly enough, I think about my last partner, and sometimes on my injured arm, I'll wear a wrist splint. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting that I was glad he was witness to was that every time we would go out, people would ask me what happened to my hand. And Jeff, before you
Yeah.
and I started recording, we talked about how even though I've been saying the same thing for 15 years and living in this body, in this disabled body for 26, it's still new to other people. And so
Yeah.
his name is Greg. So Greg was like, oh, I didn't realize how you have to repeat the same thing over and over again, and you get the same questions over and over, right? And at the same time, I have to remind myself that this is that person's first interaction with me, maybe their first interaction with the disabled person. And I don't know, I want them to not be like intrusively curious, but I want to create a level of intimacy with them so that they understand, here's the nature of my disability. I may ask you for some assistance. Just I guess we call this like managing expectations if we take this into a workplace setting.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the balance, right? You're trying to you have two things when somebody asks you that question, right? It's relitigating trauma that initially and for a very long time elicited shame, and shame is uh, an easy response to trauma, and it's obviously hard to break through. So, you are constantly reliving trauma when that's asked, but you are also understanding that yes, if that's somebody's first interaction with someone with a disability, or it's their first interaction with you, that you have to there's the balance of having to display positivity, or answer the question in earnest, because it's meant in earnest. They don't know the circumstances or the reasons behind it, right? But I can't imagine, like, I'm trying to, but I can't imagine the balancing act that every potential conversation
Yeah.
elicits.
I guess what I will say, two things come to mind. And I have learned in my own healing journey that there's a difference between reliving a story and retelling a story. So,
Mm,
reliving is let me go back into that trauma, let me tell you all the details. And retelling is, okay, I've done a lot of work around it and
yeah.
I'm going to share this for context. I don't need to go into all of the details. And so it did
Fair.
take me a period of time to make that distinction between reliving, because that's exhausting to have to go back to that place over and over, versus retelling to just provide a little bit of context. And at the same time, I guess I also wanted to add that it is just as fine for me to respond if someone sees my splint and they say, "Oh, what happened?" I could say, "Oh, I don't feel comfortable talking about it." And how can we kind of
Mhm.
like sit in that? I don't know if it's awkward or unnatural. How can we like sit in that place for a little bit and just respect people's boundaries? That, okay, you asked a question, someone doesn't feel
Yeah.
comfortable. Let's respect that and leave it there.
Well, that's the thing, right? If you're a curious person and it's well-meaning, then that curious, well-meaning person is then going to feel offended. They shouldn't be, because just because you ask a question does not mean you are required an answer. That is very clear. Earlier in this pod, when I was talking to Eddie Ndopu, one of the things he brought up was the inverse of people being too helpful, or looking like you need too much assistance. Talk to me a little bit about how the community just feels about that in general.
Yeah, so that is even a contested one as well. So first of all, I love that you had Eddie on your podcast. You're actually just reminding me that I need to reach out to him to maybe have him contribute, be featured in my book. But I guess I'll share I'll
Yes.
share I'll share two things. Today's like my day of twos. For people who there are some people who have very apparent disabilities who are tired of being offered help over and over and over again. I shared an example. So I have a social media series called the Anti-Ableism series. And I shared this example of how I went to a conference lunch and it was sit down. And sit down meals have always been really anxiety inducing for me because I can't cut the meat dish. I can't break the bread off of the
Mhm.
roll. And more often than not, I just skip the meal. And I shared that the server noticed that I was wearing a wrist splint and proactively asked if he could help me cut my chicken dish. And the number of people, so there were two types of responses on that. So my takeaway was I really appreciated how this person was proactive, because I noticed that sometimes I feel like a little bit of a burden asking someone for help. and they'll look at
Mhm.
me and maybe they won't see my disability immediately, and they'll just be like, why is this person doesn't look disabled, like why are they asking me for help? And then I feel like I've inconvenienced them. So there were two types of
Yes.
responses on that post. One was other disabled people who said, thank you so much for sharing this. Oftentimes during mealtime, because I feel so like anxiety ridden about asking other people to help me, that I go back to my hotel room and I eat an energy bar. The other
Yeah.
camp was, well, you should have just asked for help. And it kind of just shows the nuances between how, like, there's there's other people within the community who really appreciate when people are proactive, and then there are other people who wished you would let them lead.
Hmm.
And it takes a comfort level. So I will say, in this 26 years, so I acquired my disability, and I also want to name that that colors a lot of my own disability experience, because I remember what it was like to be right-handed, and then I relearned how to be left-handed. So um, I guess I wanted to share that it took me a long time before I felt more comfortable being proactive asking for help. And
Yeah.
there was a period of time where I wished someone could see that I needed assistance and was proactive. But maybe that person learned from another person to wait until the disabled person asks you, so everyone has different comfort levels. And I think as I've gotten more entrenched in these disability spaces, I have felt more comfortable, unlearning this shame. I have felt more comfortable asking for assistance when I need it. But I love that now you have, this reference conversation and Eddie's conversation as well. And I
Hmm.
often say, like, listen to a choir of disabled voices. You're going to hear all different types of suggestions. But for me, I don't know. I just think there's no harm in asking. The important part is step number 2, which is listen to the answer, which is going to be yes or no. And I think that
Yeah.
well-meaning people miss the no, I don't need help, and insert themselves into situations that a person has already declined that offer.
Yeah, that's the variable, right? You have well-meaning people or avoidant people who are able. Then you have people who are introverts or extroverts with a disability that are then, that creates a multitude of variable situations, right? And that's why, again, it's not a monolith. And I can very much understand, yes, if you've had to answer the same question, or, want to prove self sufficiency, or you have different motivations, absolutely. Don't bug me. I can do this. But,
But we don't know.
sometimes,
We don't have
yeah,
that
that's the
context.
problem. I think the best part in what you're getting at is to not make assumptions, to ask, and then be willing to follow the lead of whatever that response may be.
Yeah. And can I provide you with a script? So,
Yes.
so I used to, so in this anti-ableism series, and even when I do presentations, I'll be like, don't say this, don't do this. And a lot of people would come back and they would say, well, you're telling me not to do all these things, but you're not telling me what to do. So can you provide me some scripts? And originally I didn't want to put words into people's mouths, but what I realized is
Hmm.
you need a frame, you need something to start with, and then you can adapt it. So the phrase is, um, I'm here if you need assistance. There's no question in it. It's just, I'm here.
Hmm.
You can, and and then in that case, like, you're not waiting for a response. That person knows. You leave it at that.
Yes. Yeah, that's very clear. I think we all have room to grow. Even if we know people, even if we've had experiences, I think there's room to grow, and to not be defensive about, because I can assume that there's somebody who might be listening that's like, I just want to be helpful. I'm like, yeah, but you don't need to be defensive about it if that person doesn't want the help, right? That's that's not important. What's really important so much is, yes, I think giving people tools to approach the situation best is highly important. Let me ask you this. In the 15 years of constantly doing this and constantly evolving with it, what has been the biggest evolution, maybe in terminology or, things that are done. What has been the biggest evolution you've had?
Yeah, I guess I'll share two things again. Sorry,
Yeah, two things.
today's my 2 days, the two things day. Two things Tuesday, even though it's Thursday when we're recording this.
Maybe this will
So
drop on a Tuesday. Who knows,
I know.
Tiffany?
So the first is, you know, when I started Diversability in 2009. In 2009, our tagline at the time was we wanted to build a movement around disability pride. So it hasn't changed that much. Our tagline is now elevating disability pride together.
Yeah.
In 2009, when I would tell people that I wanted to start this group around disability pride, people would give me the reactions that I got were like, how can someone be proud to be disabled? I don't understand what that phrase is. Now in 2024, you have major cities declaring July as Disability Pride Month, or other months as Disability Pride Month. It is recognized and embraced within the community. I think the next step would be for our non-disabled friends to start to embrace disability pride and what that might look like for us. I think the second transformation, oh, and actually I have a third transformation. So the second transformation is in 2009, it was really hard to get anyone to join. And I have actually been thinking about our origin story a lot, because the first people who joined Diversability were my Taiwanese American friends in college. And this is to me where solidarity and allyship come in. They knew that this was a part of my identity. Being Taiwanese American was a big part of it too. And they wanted to show up for me because they believed in what I was trying to build. And slowly, very, very slowly, we got that first person joining. I remember putting up flyers. So we started as a campus club at Georgetown, putting up flyers around campus with this Gmail address. And all of a sudden, I started getting emails from people that I knew who had non-apparent disabilities. They were living with chronic illnesses or vision disorders. And I was like, and my name wasn't associated with it at all. And I was like, oh, there are people who could see value in this, but I wouldn't have known that they were looking for a club or a community. And slowly but surely, now in 2024, we pretty much do almost no marketing for our community. And we're growing by, we have a Facebook group. It's growing by like 30 to 50 members every week. And it also makes me realize that 80,000 sounds like a lot, but there are 61 million disabled Americans, and over a billion globally. So we still have, for us, it was when I first started this, I wanted to tackle the cycle of social isolation for disabled people. And, maybe you're not on your disability pride journey, and I hope you have found other community, but I'm also realizing there may still be a lot of isolated and really lonely disabled people out there who could use community. And then the third transformation, now we're on the threes. Maybe each question we increase the number of talking points. But the third is actually just in myself. And so when I started this journey in 2009, I was reliving my disability origin story and not retelling it. The first time I ever shared it publicly was after that 12-year period. And I cried through the whole thing because there was so much pent up pain. And also, I think the feeling of being seen for the first time in this story. And I actually will say that as a function of creating this disability community, it's helped me unlock so many other aspects of my life as a disabled person. So I have this talk where I talk about how one of my most traumatic experiences growing up as a disabled adolescent was physical education class. And no one wanted me to be there. And now I I've been going to a workout class, going to a high intensity workout class every single day. I relearned how to rock climb, how to bike. I love hiking. I've hiked Kilimanjaro. So just by being a function of community, I'm starting to realize hey, these things that I counted myself out of for so long, I'm realizing that there are adaptive groups I can join, or really supportive ones who are cheering me on to at least just try.
If you don't mind me asking, you can definitely say no in the sense of this conversation. For people who are maybe not in your community, or who are in your community who aren't at the point where they're ready to share, or they're not ready to talk, what got you to the point where you were ready to share?
Mm, I That's such a good question. So I have a quick anecdote and then I'll share my own personal experience. So the anecdote is that Diversability is intentionally open to disabled and non-disabled people. So we do some informal polling, and about 65 to 70% of our community identifies as disabled. That includes chronic illness, mental health conditions. And part of why we've done this mixed disability, not non disabled makeup is because we know that there are a lot of people who are not ready to identify as disabled. So our group is still open to you. And one of the things I get really excited about is what I call the longtime lurkers. These are people who have been lurking in our community for years, you know, and after a certain period of time, I see a post come in that says, as a function of how positive and supportive this group is, I'm ready to share my story. And that's the shame to pride transformation, right? It's like
Yeah.
you maybe are newly diagnosed. There's a new disability now called long haul COVID. And I want to acknowledge disability grief is a real thing. You'll go through the stages of grief. They may be nonlinear. I went through my grief journey. It was 12 years. So what happened at that 12-year mark? I think for me personally, that's such a good question, because I wish I could tell you it was this one immediate moment, but it was actually like a planting of a couple of seeds. But part of it was, I think, me gaining confidence in other areas of my life. So the first thing I remember was, um, interestingly enough, so I didn't identify as Taiwanese growing up. Um, my
Hmm.
parents are immigrants, and I had learned that my path to assimilation and success was downplaying my race. So when I was in college and I connected with these other Taiwanese American students, I started to develop pride, community, and culture around this one aspect of my identity that people could apparently see being Asian or being Taiwanese, but that I was erasing. And I think once I started to develop a little bit more confidence in the power of seeing what it was like to meet other Taiwanese people, it made me really curious about what would it look like if I met other disabled people, because I felt really isolated in my experience for a long time. So I call myself an accidental advocate because I didn't come out thinking that this is actually, I mean, I feel like I have this amazing career as a disability advocate now. But I didn't, in 2009, I mean, I still remember the day. I i just shared it at the time to share some context as to like why I was there or why I cared about this. But I didn't think like,
Hmm.
oh, I'm going to build this whole movement. And I think what I've also learned is there are people that I meet who see a part of themselves in my story. And that's actually why, even after 15 years, I still continue to share. I really want to like build, channeling my inner Brene Brown. I want to build this leadership built on vulnerability, built on, hey, I had this aspect of my identity that I had a lot of shame around. It still comes up. It never goes away. We're human. Um, but I'm hoping that if me imperfectly showing up helps you gain a little bit more rungs on your ladder of confidence to hopefully be on that transformational journey, then I'm willing to take the hit.
I think there's a wonderfully, you vote Brene Brown. There's a wonderfully correct adaptation in um, kind of not the 2.0 or 3.0, but whatever iteration there is of people willing to create vulnerable movements. Because I think a generation previous, the movement was always about achieving perfection or achieving the best version of self or achieving all of these things. And to me, the vulnerable leader is always best, because that's the one that seems the most real and seems the most approachable, and it seems like you can grow with and understand. And there are so many nuances to every community that if you're trying to showcase and identify perfection, there is no such thing. So vulnerability is so crucial and important to building community. And maybe it is tied to the understanding that we have social media and that community is broad, and you can't just give a talk and do whatever kind of Tony Robbins thing there used to be. So maybe we've adapted, but I'd like to think we've also just evolved in understanding that the best way to bring people together is to be vulnerable.
Yeah. And I actually think that the pandemic was actually a beautiful lesson in everyone's going through some stuff. It might be different stuff. You're living with people you don't like. You're by yourself. Like no matter what we were
Hmm.
going through, it was everyone's going through something. And can I take a pause to try and understand where they're coming from? If I have the emotional capacity to make space for that, and if I can't, even people's comfort levels around meeting up and stuff, I just thought that was, I hope we don't forget that lesson in asking about people's comfort levels, consent, boundaries, respecting boundaries, other things like that, yeah, we learned, even like remote work. I mean, there are so many things that we learned that I actually think are beneficial for the disability community as well. But yeah, I agree with you. I think that as more of us realize that all of us have mental health, some of us have
Yes.
mental health disabilities. I like to make that distinction because people are like, what about mental health? All of us have mental health. Some of us are navigating mental illnesses or mental health disabilities or mental health conditions. I use all of those words interchangeably. And I actually forget what my thought was there. But oh, sorry. But the pandemic made us realize like mental health is a part of health. And the pandemic also made us realize
Mhm.
that social health is a part of our overall well-being. So a lot of people will come to me and they'll say, "Oh, well, you're building a community. Like, what advocacy areas are you working on? Are you working on closing the disability employment gap, access to healthcare, education?" And I'm like, first, we need to be well. And our wellness is our physical health, our mental health, our social health. Social health is community, relationships, and I think people just forgot that disabled people need that. I know I went on a whole tangent. We were talking about vulnerability, but
No,
I wrapped it
I,
all in a
I, I
little
love.
bow.
No, you expand upon it because I mean, COVID was a lesson in that everybody responds to uncomfortable situations or trauma or a variety of inconveniences with either vulnerability, polite asking, being mindful of people around them, or just stubbornness. Stubbornness is also another that there's a natural response. It's like, oh, I don't want to be inconvenienced. So you can see the opposite and opposing reactions to it. But that was an interesting test case because it was one of the very few as we get into a more algorithmic nature of content, right, where we don't have that many shared experiences. That was a shared experience. Everybody
Mm,
shared that experience, and so you can it's one of those things that you can come back to and go, okay, well, how did this respond, and it can kind of tell you how we'll respond to a lot of things. Okay, Tiffany, when we do these podcasts, at the end, we do something called Keep It Short. There are 3 questions. The questions are short. Your answers can be as ever long as you want. So if you want to add 7 talking points to it, we can do that. Um, question 1, when you're setting out to write the book, what was the biggest intent?
the biggest intent is to scale my impact. One thing I'm super proud of that I had never envisioned, let's take it back to the pandemic, was coming into 2020, our work was reaching maybe like 20,000. During the pandemic, I turned to social media, like many people did, to expand my advocacy. And I started this anti-ableism series, and it's reached over 5 million. I could have never imagined that my work would reach millions of people. Now there's a book. Now the now the social media the book version of that social media series is coming into purview, and I can only imagine how many people it might reach. And can I share one quick story?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You're again. I could ask a 10-second question. Your answer can be 10 minutes.
Okay.
That's
So
totally fine.
I want to
No
share
limits.
something. My first TEDx talk is called The Power of Exclusion. It goes into the details of the car accident, and it talks about how isolated I felt, and that chronic exclusion is what made me so passionate about community. I went to an event recently where there was a pediatric surgeon who works with kids who have my injury. And he came to me and he said, I watched your TEDx talk. And I said, oh, you know what? I actually don't really like interacting with medical professionals. I just haven't had that great of an experience growing up as a kid and having my body not be mine and people talking about things I didn't understand. So I exited that situation very quickly. And I kind of felt bad, but it was kind of just like the unfiltered thing that came out. And this doctor came back to me and he said, Tiffany, because I watched your talk and you talked about the mental health aspect of not being able to use one of your arms, we have actually added a mental health professional to our entire rehabilitation team. So we've got the hand surgeon, we've got the occupational therapist, physical therapist, probably a shoulder person, and now we have mental health support. And that was an unintended, I don't know if consequence is the right word, that was unintended impact where this doctor is now going to help support other kids because a lot of people who have my injury, if you're young, sometimes they'll get surgeries, and that's trauma on your body. And trauma, to me, if someone labeled something as trauma, I would think about my mental health and how I could find some support. Now all those kids are going to have mental health support. And I think about that small tidbit, but now with this book, is that I know that when you read this book, maybe you're not going to agree with everything. And what's funny is I'm currently in editing mode on the book, and my publisher is like, hey, Tiffany, you say that the disability community is not a monolith a lot in this book. And and I'm like, we've even repeated it. We've repeated it a lot in this podcast, even, less than an hour. And I think that part is so important, but there will be some aspects that will land with you. Like I have friends. So there's one section of the book where we talk about when we use disability terms as metaphors. So one that is pretty popular is when people say paralyzed by fear. So what I have is a type of paralysis on my arm, and I often will encourage people what are you really trying to say? Or what are some alternatives that you could say instead that don't frame paralysis as this bad thing? And I've had friends who have heard me say something like that and then went onto their website immediately and changed the language, right? So all of that to say, just wanted to share some stories to add some color that I'm just hoping that this book will make an impact on people's own allyship journey.
I'm glad. I was going to do it if you didn't do it. I was going to come right back to the initial statement, which was impact, right? For a lot of people, everybody has a different journey when it comes to writing a book, because there's some people who have imposter syndrome, like, I can't possibly be a person worthy of writing a book. And others, they're very much like, no, there's a purpose for this and it serves people other than me. And that I think can drive you, because it's I don't think we necessarily, any of us, set out to write a book when we start our career, but inevitably you do reach a point where wanted and needed and important, and yes, please keep saying that the entire community is not a monolith, because that needs to be understood by a lot of people.
Yeah, and I guess I will say that I definitely have so much imposter syndrome. I'm terrified. I actually wrote a post on Threads. That was my first viral post on Threads. You can go viral there. And it was about how I was terrified. I'm terrified about this book because but I'm also realizing that the mission is bigger than myself and my own fears around it, which is actually how I work around my own imposter syndrome. Like, this isn't about me. It's about all of the people, all of the tides, hopefully lifting up. Like, even the fact that me as a disabled Asian author got a book deal, I hope opens up more pathways for other people who look like me to get their stories shared.
Yeah, and I would assume there's probably a little felt pressure too when it's about the community, about wanting that to go forward too. So I mean, there are a lot of different layers into it. There's a lot of positivity and pressure and all these different things that other people don't have to think about, because when you're not trying to,
Can I say something about pressure?
Yes.
So I used to carry the weight of dismantling ableism on my shoulders. And
that's weight.
That's a lot. And I had to realize, and this is also why I've built this community, is I am not single-handedly, and actually, pun intended, I'm not single-handedly going to dismantle ableism by myself. It takes a collective, it takes a community. that's why, like, even though we're not a monolith, there are some things that we can agree on. We can agree that disability inclusion is important. We may have different opinions about how we get there, but we're all moving that needle forward, right? So yeah, I guess for me, I've taken a little bit of that pressure off to say I'm doing what I can in the spaces that I can. I'm coming on your podcast. Your listeners will now hear this. Hopefully they'll go check out Eddie's episode as well. And for the people that I don't reach, hopefully, you know, the LinkedIn first, second, third degrees will reach them eventually.
Question 2. TED Talk, speech, video, thing other than yourself that you've watched that's been most inspiring to you?
I know I mentioned Brene Brown earlier. I read Daring Greatly in 2016, and that's actually when I decided to shift my own leadership to let me peel back the onion layers and not try to present this perfect view of myself.
Yes.
I also think all of her TED Talks are incredible. I've learned so much. She calls it about building shame resilience, around how shame festers and grows, and even on my own journey of unlearning shame. So that one, all of those.
Question 3 might be the easiest question. Is there an industry that doesn't need mental health support?
No.
Yeah.
Even like mental health professionals need mental health support.
Yes.
And also, like, I'm
real.
like, so I would call myself a community builder first, a disability advocate second. As a community person, I need communities too. I'm in a community of other people who run communities. So
It's just deception. Yeah.
I know. But yeah, I think none of us. I was actually telling someone today that I saw like a social media post that said the only way that we don't get triggered is if we don't interact with anybody. Right? You don't have the stimulus. And I kind of laughed when I saw that. And I was like, oh, it's true. Like, we can isolate ourselves and not know that there's healing that needs to be done, or we can go out, show up vulnerably, see where the cracks are that maybe we want to put some gold glue in. I think they call that. I think they call it ikigai. I don't know if you've heard like the broken porcelain bowls that in the cracks you put the
I
gold.
have.
And those cracks are golden. But yeah, I think we all need support. And if we don't label it as mental health support, you know, some people find sports teams, some people find the things that work for them, and they may call it different things, but all of us have mental health. And I do think as a function of the pandemic, all of us are emerging with some level of recognizing how important it is and how we all have it, and we were affected in one way or another.
Yeah. Tiffany, this has been wonderful. I appreciate you taking all the time. And if I've learned anything, I am here if you need assistance.
I appreciate it.
Thank you. All right.